China has concluded large-scale military drills around Taiwan, further agitating cross-strait tensions.
Beijing says it was a just move to safeguard national sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Taiwan, which China claims as its own, has condemned the 13-hour-long exercise. Its leader, William Lai, also vowed to defend the island's democracy and security.
The U.S. has strongly criticized China's move, calling it disproportionate and destabilizing. For more on the strains between China and Taiwan and its impact on the wider geopolitical sphere, let's speak now with Oriana Skylar Mastro. She's a center fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. And she's also the author of Upstart, How China Became a Great Power. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. Firstly, just considering that the scale, nature, the timing of the recent drills, some analysts have been saying this is a new front in China's ongoing gray zone operations. How do you assess these exercises in terms of the capabilities and strategies of the PLA?
Well, it's new and it isn't. Of course, every time we see these major exercises, they increase in sophistication and they increase in the number of platforms involved. So this time we had a record number of aircraft, over 120 aircraft that were involved, ships, the carrier. But I say it's also not really a change because this is the trend of Chinese military activity around Taiwan. They're not only trying to send a signal to Taipei, they're also trying to exercise and rehearse any sort of actual plans for invasion of the island. And for that to happen, they do have to practice the air and the naval and all these different components working together on such a large scale.
Professor, I have to ask you about Joint Sword 2024B, though, because it lasted one day, which is probably the shortest combined arms exercise that I've ever heard of. So was it something that was activated at short notice in reaction to William Lai's speech? Or is this more of a PLA parade almost, showing off its military might?
So I think it was something that was planned. That doesn't necessarily mean all the details of it were planned, but at this stage, the Chinese military, the Communist Party, they're always ready to respond with some sort of military coercion to these big events, whether it's an inauguration speech, a National Day speech, elections in Taiwan. We've now reached this point where Beijing is really relying on this military coercion. In my discussions with members of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, they say that the strategy is really to show Taiwan that there is no chance of defense by constantly bombarding them with this image of how much just more sophisticated, large, and capable the Chinese military is to Taiwan's military. So I don't think it came as a surprise to the Chinese that they were doing these exercises. They probably prepared for them, assuming that President Lai was going to say something that they weren't going to be particularly happy with.
Professor Mastro, apart from the sheer number of vessels and planes that were reportedly deployed, we also understand that they were deployed very close to Taiwan and in very dense formations that essentially blocked off the island. Do you see this as a new level of aggression on display by Beijing?
Well, it can be seen as a new level of aggression because the whole purpose is the intimidation of the island of Taiwan. But in terms of the density, the thing I find much more important is trying to assess how ready China is really to engage in what we call a joint operation, the ability of all their different services to work together. This would be necessary if China was actually going to use force and try to take the island by force. And so in past exercises, you might have seen different services, different components operating quite far from one another. And so the more dense they are in terms of ships being close to aircraft, being close to missiles, the closer and closer all those different elements come together, the closer they are to being ready to do an actual operation against the island. So that's something really to look out for, not only the size and scale of the platforms involved, but how intricately they're actually working together.
Professor, I wonder what's going through William Lai's mind right now. We did hear the Taiwan Defense Ministry, they did vow defense, but really hasn't escalated tensions in response to this recent military drill. So what sort of considerations do you think are guiding Taiwan's approach? And if additional exercises are to follow, how do you expect Taiwan and its allies, the U.S., responding to further provocations?
Well, one of the reasons China does this is how complex it is to respond to. I can't speak for President Lai, but I'm sure that there's a lot of concern about the legitimacy of Taiwan's position. I think at this point that they're of course concerned about self-defense, but when it comes to responding to exercises in and of themselves, the big concern is demonstrating the ability of the government to respond and having the necessary defensive capabilities to keep safe and to keep open, their ports, their airports, and other things. But when it comes to this level of Chinese activity, the Beijing is trying to routinize the amount that their military is around Taiwan. And this is not just an intimidation tactic, it's also kind of a legal one. China claims that it has full sovereignty and control over the island of Taiwan, and therefore has a legitimate right to engage in these types of activities in any airspace or waters that Taiwan claims as its own. So the more that Beijing is actually capable, physically capable of engaging in these spaces without pushback from Taiwan or from the United States, there is concern that, their case for full control gets strengthened and becomes more legitimate. And the international community just normalizes these sorts of exercises. Just like the news doesn't report now every time there's an incident in the South China Sea, I think the hope is that 4 years from now, you won't be covering exercises of this scale because they will become so normal and so frequent.
Okay, I like the word routinize. So is it working? Because what the U.S. did was basically call the drills unwarranted, asked Beijing to act with restraint. So is it something that, is this a movie the White House has seen before? Is it working? And is this really just about all the Biden administration can do, in terms of options available?
So whether or not it's working kind of depends on from whose perspective and what the goals are. It is working in that I think it does put the United States in a difficult position and undermines the U.S. role because, in essence, of course, the United States made a lot of statements, but it didn't do anything to stop the drills, to undermine the drills. And the reason for that is because of fear of escalation to a broader conflict. So as long as China is willing to take the risks of escalation to war and the United States isn't, the United States is always going to be on the back foot. Now, if you ask me how much the strategy actually works, in the end, these gray zone tactics, intimidation, whether it be exercises, cyber, misinformation, China is going to be engaging in all of these activities. But it's my assumption, based on my knowledge of domestic politics in Taiwan, that the people of Taiwan are not going to fully capitulate to Communist Party rule without a direct use of force. And so from that perspective, these types of activities are not going to get Beijing where they want to be, which is, full control over the island.
I appreciate your insight and your time this morning. Professor Oriana Skylar Mastro, a Center's Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Thank you.